In this podcast episode, I am going to review a semi-well-known self-development book. At least the author is pretty well known. His name is Benjamin P. Hardy, and he has quite the following in the personal development world. He's written a few books, and from what I can tell, I used to follow him a few years ago loosely, and he's basically an organizational psychologist with a PhD from Clemson University. He's the father of 6. He lives in Windermere, Florida. And I knew him because at the time he was on a lot of online business podcasts saying he was making a substantial amount of money pumping out ebooks on personal development. I think he eventually put out 15. I didn't really follow up or really dig too deep because for me, I write what I think is worthwhile, and I didn't feel like I had enough for an ebook, and for him to pump them out so often, it just seemed at the time it just didn't seem like something I could do. I write a few blog posts, but each one is pretty meaningful to me in my eyes, and I didn't want to add a lot of fluff just to make it an ebook. The point being, he's also one of the most read writers on Medium.com. Back when Medium was very big, that was also a special thing where he clearly mastered the game of viral personal development content. There's a certain style to it, and clickbaity titles. And that's not to say that his content's all fluff, because clearly a lot of people followed him, tens of thousands, and apparently he made five figures a month from his stuff. And then I never really followed him again until I had some free time, and I wanted to actually read one of his books. And this was one of the books he was really marketing hard for a while. This was one of the ones where it didn't seem like it was just another ebook. This was his kind of almost like his opus. This was his book that he was hoping to become hardback and sold everywhere and bestseller. So, point being, I read it. It's called Willpower Doesn't Work, Discover the Hidden Keys of Success. And I am going to try and keep this podcast very concise. I have a theory out there that people assume that, oh, it's a podcast, they're going to give you the time of day. They'll give you more of leeway than YouTube. And then YouTube, you have to, every second has to count, every edit, every word you say has to count to keep the retention high. And, they start clicking off immediately. So that's why everyone's videos are heavily edited and highly engaging, and they have the perfect thumbnail and title, and they're only 5 minutes long. I have a theory that podcasts, you still have to earn the attention, and it's still competitive like YouTube, just a little less, since they will give you the time, since maybe you're listening to this on a jog or at the gym or driving your car. At least that's what I do. So point being, I will try and keep this value-packed and concise. So let's just get to this book and my review of it and what I learned. So this book is only 256 pages, which is really not that much. It was my first real introduction to Ben's work. I'm really proud of his success, for him to make that money. It was something I could not emulate. I just kept to what I could do, which was, a blog post every 2 weeks or so. And my writing isn't as good as his. His is very much formatted for that viral, almost BuzzFeed stuff. And who's to say that's bad? But I wanted to finally give it a try, see what the big hype is. He does have this following. And we're just really curious, who is he? Who is he to give advice? And what makes his books tick so well? So I would give the book a rating of a 3 out of 5. And let me explain why, and let me give you the thesis of the book and what I learned. So the thesis, as the title implies, is that willpower doesn't work. We all are told in self-help books and personal development books. Oh, it's all about your willpower, just like man up, be tougher to succeed, and just will yourself to greater gains at the gym, better eating habits, less junk food, a successful business, whatever it is. But ironically, by February, the statistics show that most people have already given up on their New Year's resolutions. So he quotes a few stats here and there and basically says that willpower clearly doesn't work. So why do you keep trying to do it? Because it's clearly not working, and it's clearly not your fault. We blame our own laziness and whatnot, and it's clearly not our fault. So very good hook, right? And arguably a unique perspective. And then he concludes his thesis by saying that what really helps is your environment. Everything is really about changing and hacking your environment. And he claims essentially that everyone has been affected by their environment. Like the person who is lazy and has issues with their parents and has trauma and communication issues, well, that didn't all come from a vacuum. That came from how he was born and raised, the parents and environment he was around. So, yeah, initially a very convincing, unique argument, right? And yeah, at first I was like, okay, this is intriguing. These are good points at first. And, he goes on to say how, he's raised a bunch of foster kids, and he's realized how poorly conditioned they were, and how they would gravitate to drugs as their only and immediate way of solving any type of emotional pain, just based off conditioning and whatnot, and how much their environment and upbringing before they were adopted played a impact on their behavior, and how through good parenting, all of a sudden, they've changed completely. Really convincing. So you're probably wondering, well, what's with the 3 out of 5 rating? Where did it go downhill? Well, I think he brings up a lot of good points, but as I went on in the book, I started having thoughts of disagreement, or I was like, well, that's not necessarily true, or whatnot. I think he brings up some good points, but is it all environment? No, I don't think so. And then a lot of the book, frankly, I felt like a lot of the points brought up, to me at least, as someone who is pretty well versed in personal development. I mean, I literally have a blog and my own podcast, and I've been doing this for years. A lot of the points I had heard in some shape or form before. They were just slightly packaged differently. I mean, there's a lot of things in there, especially the second half of the book, that were really just things I'd heard before. Like it really wasn't anything revolutionary. Now, maybe his audience are beginners, so it's all new to them, but a lot of it was just kind of like standard stuff that maybe you've heard before as well. Like, cut out all the sugar in your room and in your house. That way your environment is super clean, and even if you want sugar, you can't have it, and you just adjust. And then he brings up the point how he took that out of his house, and his kids didn't notice because they still had snacks and stuff. They're just healthy snacks. And I don't know. That's not the first time I heard that. I mean, first time I heard that was probably in 2013-ish, maybe, back when I was watching fitness content. And I think a lot of people said that. The most prominent one I remember was this Minecraft YouTuber called Thaddeus Petersmith, who was semi-famous on there. And he would just play Minecraft videos and give fitness and dating advice and talk about whatever he wanted. So, I don't know, for me, it wasn't revolutionary advice. However, for you or others, it could be useful. I mean, he did package it in different ways. What I noticed he did was he did a lot of research, and he kind of cherry-picked different studies or stories, historical stories, and he would sprinkle them throughout the book. So, each time he would bring up a new point, he would sprinkle through a story or scientific study here or there. Not necessarily a new technique. It works for some, that's how other books, like Dale Carnegie's books, same type of deal, even though Dale wrote those books 50 years ago, and it works. That's it. I think there's trade-offs to that approach. Robert Greene does it as well with his books, but the trade-off with that approach is that, like, you're kind of cherry-picking tips or evidence to support your point. You're not examining contradictory evidence refuting your point. So you're really following that confirmation bias thing. So that said, I would give him the pass there. I think it was still a very interesting book. It gave a lot of interesting tips and perspectives. And even though many of them were not new to me and I wasn't particularly fond of them, it did introduce some new ideas here or there. And hence, I felt it was worth checking out. Or at least it brought me at least a little bit of a new perspective. I think the one story that stands out for his whole point about environment was that he had a friend who basically ran a fairly successful real estate business in his local area. Then he experimented by buying a Tesla and selling his kind of old, rickety 1990s Camry. Now, he was fine with the Camry. It worked fine, and he was successful, but he wanted to see if that conveyed a bad image. I mean, people shouldn't judge someone by their cover, but people do. And so he bought this expensive Tesla, and it worked. His business sales for his online course, like 3x'd. He got like 2,000 friend requests from people as he posted about his Tesla. His business exploded. He became the #1 real estate person ranked in the local area. All this other stuff happened, and he had a lot of confidence. So that story stood out. I thought that was a unique story, and he even gained more self-confidence from it. And I think this is like, while it was very informative and useful, I think this is where I started to disagree a bit with Ben. So his whole point from that story was that, as you can see, your environment clearly affected things. He changed his environment, which changed his results. And to that, I say, well, was it really his environment or his marketing? It was really his marketing, his signals he sent to change the perception of others. It's kind of sad, but people judge how rich you are by what they see, even though that's oftentimes not a good reflection. This guy was already rich. He just chose a old Camry, probably for economic reasons. I mean, it's more humble too. But people didn't think he was rich because of it, and they assumed he was still poor. Such a superficial thing, but people did it. And so it was really, if anything, it's a argument that marketing is important for business. Not so much that changing your environment changes results. I really thought that was a way of twisting a story to fit his thesis. And so that was an example of something that was still very interesting and informative to me, but really wasn't that convincing on my point. But definitely a story that stood out. And also the whole fact that it improved his self-confidence. I mean, I would argue that's partially from a feedback loop. With those new signals, people treated him better. And then because of that, he felt more confident about himself. Now, one could go down a rabbit hole about, well, should you base your self-esteem on external people's opinions, or should you have an internal locus of control that's more sustainable and not so affected by external people, which you can't control as well? And I mean, that's a topic for another day. Long story short, I I think it's more important to have an internal locus of self-esteem. But, jumping back to the main point, I think this book, Willpower, doesn't work. If you're a beginner, still worth a read. If it's new to you, or you're not new to self-development, I mean, go in there with a grain of salt. I mean, it still may be worth a read, just for you to check out some new perspectives. He has a few cool ideas, but I definitely felt like the second half of the book, he just rambled and kind of went off track into just a flurry of personal development tips that were semi-related to his whole thesis. The first half of the book was fairly correlated with his thesis, which I felt was pretty good, and it was strewn with examples and evidence and studies about it. Now, I think one of the other issues I had with the book was this whole idea of willpower is not everything. Environment is everything. Just change your environment. Just like fix it and change the people you hang around because you're the average of the 5 people. Those are good points. Is that everything though? And is your environment really everything? I would argue no, because for example, for me, I've posted on about this a bit for a while on my email newsletter, but I've been had the fortune of traveling the USA for the last 2 years. In fact, I'm still traveling, and so I've been able to see various different cities and see how the environment affects a lot of me. And sure, I do notice an effect to an extent. In cities with much less to do, I tend to just work out a lot more because there's nothing else to do, which is a two-sided sword. I mean, life is not just about working out, but that is helpful. And that being said, I wouldn't say it's everything. Certain bad habits, certain thinking still follows me around. Even going to cities that I thought would just change my life and staying there for a while, like New York, I stayed there for quite a while, a few months, like 3 to 4 months. Austin, Miami, bigger cities, for example, they were not as game-changing as I thought. I still hit my routine and stuff. I even went out of my way to go to more networking events and stuff, but more or less, things stayed the same. I think it helps. Clearly, I think in the long run, it will help. Certain cities like Austin just have a lot more tech people. San Francisco, same thing. So it'll likely eventually lead to greater job opportunities. But at the same time, I wouldn't say, your environment is everything. I mean, you take someone with bad habits and terrible thinking, and you really think putting them into a different city, surrounding them with a group of people, that alone will change everything. I mean, they have to be open-minded enough to even accept their advice. And if the contrast is too great, they're not going to accept it. They're going to see them as too different from them and just say, you're all millionaires, I'm not. And they probably won't change. Plus, and I think the book does acknowledge this point, most people can't drastically change their environments like me and go to a new city or whatnot. And so a lot of the book's tips are more micro tips, focus on changing your immediate environment, your room, your house, and stuff like that, which, how much can you do there? And then, funny enough, I'm reading another book right now, Dale Carnegie's How to Stop Worrying and Start Living. And the thing with when you read more books or you get more and more experts' advice, you run into conflicting advice. So Dale is saying kind of the opposite. He says the environment doesn't matter. It's how you perceive the world, your attitude. And he gives a story about how he, when he was young, he was just kind of this skeptical, negative guy, like filled with stress and worry. And he lived in Missouri, but he decided to take a trip to Miami, which was a tropical vacation place, to try and get a new job and, kind of take a vacation and get his mind off of it. And sure enough, as his dad predicted, he still had the same stresses and issues in his mind, even though he moved there and he was on a beach, because he had brought that himself, basically brought his mindset with him. So Dale's whole point is like, the man's mind can make a paradise out of a really bad situation, or a nightmare out of a good situation. So, in my opinion, I think the point is somewhere in between those two. Ben does acknowledge a lot of those other opinions at the start of the book. He says, oh, the typical self-help book will tell you it's all about your mind. You could be in the most terrible situation in the ghetto and whatnot, and with just the right mindset and changing how you believe and perceive the world, you'll get out there and you'll succeed. And he says, that's wrong. That doesn't happen. And it's really about changing your environment. And I can see where he's coming from. Yeah, in extreme environments, I mean, it's really tough to get out of. Let's say you have toxic parents, toxic family, you're in a very impoverished area, you have spotty internet connection. I can see how all those things together, just like absolutely terrible environment for your growth, would make it very hard for one to just flip their mindset and get out of it. So I can see where he's coming from there. And so I think the answer is not right where this book says it is, where it's all about your environment, because there are cases for when people got out of kind of tough situations. I think one commonly cited example is Oprah Winfrey, who was abused and had a child that had a miscarriage and all this stuff when she was young, and she didn't let that define her. She got some good jobs. She got a good job in Baltimore, outgrew that, moved to Chicago, and just continued to succeed, even though she had a tough environment. But it does make it much, much tougher. And I'm sure there's a lot of people with very tough ghetto environments that never make it out because they lack the education and all that stuff. And of course, you have people like Bill Gates who pour over those education statistics for his nonprofit to improve. I think his foundation has two goals. Or at the time I checked, it had two. One was to improve the education of the U.S., which was a kind of a domestic goal, and then the second was to eradicate polio and kind of fix certain international issues related to death. One was polio, another was malaria, another was I think it was urine and feces flowing into the water supply in Africa. Point being, clearly there's a lot of different perspectives on this, and I think while he does make a valiant point, and he does have certain credentials about this, I think his PhD or his studies, at his research was on what makes people successful. He is still just an individual with an opinion. So, if you do check out this book, take it with a grain of salt. Come in there with an open mind, but realize, he is a person with his own tips and ideas that may be wrong. But I think you could still get something valuable from the book, some really interesting stories and thoughts and scientific studies and unique perspectives. So with that, I will conclude my review of this book. And yes, thank you for listening. See you in the next podcast, and check out my blog, dreamlifelab.org.